Oh, he was just careful to turn me on to make sure that you can actually hear me, which would be nice. Okay, my name is Ingrid Towey, as he said, and I'm from Red Hat. And yes, Red Hat, woo! Thank you, Sean. You really do get a red fedora during new hire orientation. I thought, why not wear it? So Red Hat is built around open source software, Linux in particular. And the idea is that you can edit the code, everybody can look at it. Well, in addition to being built around open source software, we also have, Red Hat is an open organization. And what does that mean, really? Well, we have an open culture. Now, and our CEO thought it was so special that he actually wrote a book about it called The Open Organization. And maybe you'll even get to see a picture of the book in a minute. So, what does that mean to be open? Does it mean we never close our doors? Never put the lids on the pickle jar? What does that mean exactly? Well, who here drinks LaCroix? Oh, look at all these hands. Do you have a favorite flavor? Oh, okay, yeah, a lot of people, that's actually a favorite flavor a lot of places. Passion fruit is favorite for a lot of people. And I'd say my favorite is probably grapefruit. And everybody at Red Hat has an opinion. It's really more like a religion at Red Hat than it is like a flavor of seltzer. So we all have to have a survey every year to pick the favorite flavors that are going to be stocked in the break room. And this year, it's this quarter, because we change every quarter, it's peach, pear, and passion fruit. But it's such a contentious subject that we actually have to do the survey, and we had to have it analyzed by an internal statistician. Because we just care that much about it. And I mean, at this point, I would be showing you this really nice pie chart he did, because pamplemousse, like you, that is actually the favorite flavor at Red Hat with 19.8% of the overall vote. So that just should give you a feel for what it means to be open at Red Hat. Okay, well, it's hard for our CEO, Jim Whitehurst, to keep up with our crazy group. And actually, Forbes magazine had this to say about it. It said, Jim Whitehurst started out with a more traditional outlook on how to run a company. But he became evangelized by Red Hat, and now ignites and catalyzes the raucous tribe that is the open source enthusiasts at Red Hat. Raucous tribe. Well, who here has seen the Roadrunner cartoons? Okay, everybody here. Do you identify with the coyote or the Roadrunner? Okay, both. Yeah, well, when I first came to Red Hat, I felt that my life was a lot like, probably more like the coyote, and everybody around me was the Roadrunner. They were just going as fast as they could. And I was trying like mad to keep up. It was crazy. And that's pretty much the way it feels at Red Hat all the time for everyone. And the real trick is, how do we keep ourselves going instead of opposite directions or directions that are at right angles? How do we keep ourselves going in the same direction? How do we keep all this open source enthusiasm and channel it so that it's all in a single direction? Well, one way we do it is we had something called Ask Me Anything. Those of you who already do Reddit are probably familiar with Ask Me Anything. We went to Jim Whitehurst and he basically said, just write up all your questions and then we'll vote, and whichever questions get the highest votes, those are the ones I'll answer. So now we know that Jim would rather fight a horse-sized duck than 100 duck-sized horses. He actually had a really great rationale for it. He was like, well, look, I like big challenges, so I'll go with the horse-sized duck. And then afterwards, after I've conquered it and killed it, we can have this great duck feast. Okay. And there were some serious questions, too, like, is it ever okay for us to use proprietary software? Here's a little note, we do. There's arguments regularly on Memo List, which is our company-wide email list, about why we shouldn't be, but we do. So just to give you a little aside on the memo list, memo list is something that everybody in the company is automatically subscribed to. All 10,000 people, when you join the company, it's unmoderated, anybody can post, and people do, and you would not believe what they say. So that was it. One of the things is that we had these arguments about proprietary software. Some of the other questions he answered were, who do you think our biggest competitor is? And now we all know that a hot dog is indeed a sandwich. Just in case you wondered, better to know, oh, look, this is what I feel like at Red Hat most of the time. So thank you for your efforts here. Keep going. Okay. So what might look like criticism and insubordination in other companies actually looks like construction and analysis to us. Keep going. So here's my Ask Me Anything. Here's my horse-sized duck. Here's my duck-sized horses, 100 duck-sized horses. It'll keep painting. There you go. Yeah, just keep going. We also have something called the Open Decision Framework. And what that means is everybody has a voice in decisions that affect them. So say we're going to reorganize your department, which happened in my department recently. The person who came up with the new org structure was actually somebody just basically at my level. And then we had this big discussion, and everybody piled on, and we had blogs, and we had comments, and then at the end of it all, they listened to the feedback, and they came up with a new org. And that happens pretty much for all the decisions in the company. Sometimes we do operate like an ordinary company, but I'd say 90% of the time, this is really what it looks like. And we always try to keep our decisions customer-centric. We always try to be thinking about how can we serve our customers the best, because we love working there, and we want Red Hat to continue so we can keep working there and not have to go someplace else where things are not nearly so fun. Okay, next one. So grassroots efforts are the only kinds of efforts that work at Red Hat. That's just kind of one of the givens. For me, coming from other types of companies, this was a real big eye-opener. Next slide. So when we were coming up with a decision for my group, we were basically, well, this is not even the reorg. We were actually trying to come up with writing standards. I thought, hey, I'm a technical editor. I've been in the industry for a long time. I've worked at a lot of different companies. Why don't I come up with writing standards? We'll just spread them out across the group. Everybody will love that. No. With over 100 people working across 4 different geos, Australia, Europe, North America, and Latin America, we knew that that wasn't going to work. Oh, and India, we knew that that wasn't going to work. I found out that wasn't going to work the hard way. And one of the first things we did was we found out there were actually 11 different groups who mostly didn't know about each other, who were all trying to develop writing standards. So next slide. So one of the things that actually was my particular passion out of these writing standards was minimalism, the idea that you can basically write really clean documentation. And we thought, hey, how can we get minimalism, how can we get people to try it? Because we were having kind of not a lot of luck in having people try it in their writing, having the people rewrite their work to be more minimalist. So we thought, well, let's try crowdsourcing. That's another open source method. And actually, 2 of my compatriots, one in Australia and one in Europe, were the ones who came up with the original idea, and I kind of put my own particular twist on it in North America. Next slide. So what is crowdsourcing? It's a combination of the words crowd and outsourcing. And what that really means is that you take a group of people, usually self-selecting, it certainly is in our case, and you outsource a body of work or fundraising to them. So Wikipedia is a really excellent example of outsourcing or crowdsourcing, as is Linux itself. Next slide. So before I really go into talking about what makes crowdsourcing successful, or why crowds are wise, since the title of my talk is The Wisdom of Crowds, let me give you an example of that from my actual life, what makes a wise crowd. I went for a walk for the hungry. This was many years ago, and it's called a crop walk. And what people do is they pledge a certain amount of money for every kilometer that you walk. Next slide. So here I am with my friends. This really was a long time ago. Next slide. And we were all out walking, As it turned out, for some reason, I don't know why, we were walking with this little guy named Casey. He was about 8 years old. He's about this tall. My husband is about this tall. I was about that tall. You know, so he was walking with a bunch of adults. And everything was going great. We were following the crowd. Everybody had T-shirts. There were signposts. And then all of a sudden, we got lost. We couldn't find any signposts. We didn't see that many people. And my husband said, well, let's go that way. And he kind of pointed to an empty piece of sidewalk. And Casey looked around, and he spotted a group of people. He said, no, we need to follow them. And he was right. They were all wearing crop walk T-shirts. My husband looked over, and he said, no, I think we need to go this way, because I think we'll meet up with the group that way. It'll be fine. And Casey said, all of them are smarter than you. And it's really true. Sometimes the smartest person in the group is nowhere near the intelligence of the group as a whole. Okay, next slide. Next slide. So I just wanted to investigate, why is it that crowdsourcing works? So I looked at this book called The Wisdom of Crowds by James Surowiecki. Next slide. And he has all kinds of great examples about why crowdsourcing works. And he talks about Google, and he talks about Linux, and he talks about the stock market and how that works. One of the really great stories I loved was the story of the hunt for the missing submarine called the Scorpion. This is from the 1960s, so they didn't have the kind of satellite tracking that we have now. So what happened was this Scorpion was lost on its way from Europe to its home base in Virginia, and they didn't know how to find it. So they assigned a guy named Craven to go and look at it. Next slide. And Craven came up with a set of scenarios for what he thought was possible for how the submarine might have gotten lost. You know, he guessed at some different speeds, different scenarios for what the problem had been. And then once he had a set of scenarios, he actually gathered up a group of people, mathematicians, submarine experts, salvage experts, people who were from different fields but who all had an interest in finding the submarine. And then he had them argue and debate and set up bets. And if they won the bet, they got a bottle of Chivas Regal. And if you don't know what Chivas Regal is, it's a very expensive kind of scotch. So that was their kind of prize, their incentive for coming up with the right idea. Next slide. So by the time they had gone through this several hours worth of debate and bets and wagers, and several bottles of Chivas had been won by everybody in the group, Craven had a set of results. He took those back, he did math on them, and then they went out and they looked for the submarine. Next slide. As it turned out, they found the wreck of the submarine. This is a piece from the wreck, and it was 220 yards from the initial place where they had actually been looking for, the place where they started looking. So 220 yards. None of the experts that he had talked to, I mean, we're talking about, this is the Atlantic Ocean they're looking in. None of the experts actually knew where the submarine was, but all of them together had little pieces of the entire puzzle, and together they had something that was very close to the actual result. But why did it work? Because, people can get together and guess, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Next slide. What James Surowiecki says in The Wisdom of Crowds is that there were basically 4 different conditions that this group met that made it effective. There was an external structure, and that was the set of scenarios that Craven came up with at the beginning. There was a diverse group of experts. Now, you can't just get any Joe off the street and have them go find the submarine. They needed people who knew something about the conditions. But they were diverse, so it wasn't like we just had salvage experts. We had mathematicians, we had these different people. And then they were independent. They didn't really know each other that well, so there was no danger of groupthink. Because groupthink is one of the problems you can have when you get a crowd of people together and you're supposed to do an analysis or critique. And then finally, I'm in the middle of this, so I'm going to move over. They needed someone to aggregate the results, a neutral party who could look at the information and do math, in this case, to basically figure out how the results were going to be, which ones to really follow up on. Next slide. And again, as any Red Hatter knows, as we learn over the years, all of us together are smarter than any one of us alone. And that's what this kind of story proves. Keep going. So our experiment was to take this idea of crowdsourcing and use it to evangelize minimalism in our company, to get people to try it. So what we did is we ended up doing a series of minimalist critiques using this sort of crowdsourcing methodology. Next slide. And as it turned out, our group in North America, where we were slightly more successful than in Europe and Australia, had the characteristics that James Surowiecki talks about in his book. We had the external structure. That was the minimalist principles. We had a diverse group of experts. The people that were coming in to do the crowdsourcing were from all different walks of life. I came from a pharmaceuticals background with UX. Some of the other people were from IBM or NetApp. Some of them had been writers a long time. And others of them were brand new, fresh out of college. In addition, because of the way Red Hat is structured, we're all fairly independent. We don't really work together. Now, that can be a downside sometimes, but in the case of crowdsourcing, it was actually worked to a good effect for us. And finally, we had that person to aggregate at the end, and that was me. I would take the results that different people came up with, and I'd put them all together. And that way, we had all the characteristics that James Surowiecki identified as being necessary for a crowd to work. Next slide. So, if some of you are not familiar with minimalism in writing, I'm going to take a minute and just explain what it is, and then we'll go back to our method. Next slide. So minimalism in art and architecture is all about getting back to the fundamentals of design. This is a picture of theater seating. And you'll notice that actually theater lecture seating, but unlike going to the opera in Milan or something like that, these seats are very simple. There's no ornamentation. There's no extra curlicues, no gold leaf. Everything is focused around, I think the laser pointer actually works. Well, maybe not.
Second to top.
Second to the top? Okay. Oh, well, there we go. You'll notice that there's a curve, and that curve is repeated. That is the minimal design element that's repeated in the case of this. And actually, the photograph in itself is also a minimalist photograph. Next slide. But minimalism in writing is also focusing on fundamentals, but different fundamentals. It's focusing like a laser on what the customer needs and wants to do. That's what minimalist writing is. Next slide. These are the characteristics of minimalist writing. Customer focus, action orientation with good, strong action verbs, findability. You've got to be able to find your content. Good, strong headings, no extraneous information, good troubleshooting. Make it easy for your customer or your reader to roll back to the previous state so that he can actually do his work if something goes wrong. Next slide. So our meeting process basically followed this structure. I'm trying to give you kind of the basics so that you can go and do it yourself later at home with your group. First, every time we have a meeting, we review the minimalist principles as we've crystallized them at Red Hat. And we assign a note taker, so that's 2. And then we take whatever document we're reviewing and we go through each minimalist principle one at a time and say whether the document is meeting that principle. Next slide. Then, after the meeting is over, we go through a consolidation process where a single person aggregates the feedback, shares the doc with the group so that they can add corrections, and then finally, that single person, usually it's me, meets with the author of the document to give them the feedback one-on-one in a personal kind of way. Because, at Red Hat, we may be able to criticize and be criticized, but we do try to be kind. And I think that you should think about that anytime you do a critique, is to give people positive feedback and be kind and gentle and private. Next slide. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through our 5 minimalism principles as we have learned them at Red Hat, the things we've crystallized as being the essentials of minimalism. And I'm going to show you a before and after for different pieces of content we've actually done minimalist critiques on. So the first minimalist principle is focus on the reader's goals, and which probably makes sense because that's what I've been talking about. That's the fundamental of minimalism. And take an action-oriented approach. Next slide. So when you're focusing on these readers' goals, how much content does the customer have to wade through to get to do something they recognize as real work? Do you separate conceptual and background information from the tasks people need to do to get something done? Next slide. So one document we reviewed as a group was called Checklist to Prevent Issues when Setting Up EAP. Just an aside, EAP is a standard acronym, and most people would be looking for the acronym, Enterprise Application Platform, and not the actual word, so that's why it has an acronym, to prevent issues. And next slide. So what we frequently do is we'll frequently take a look at kind of the table of contents, which is what we did here, and try to look at the headings and say to ourselves, is this meeting customer needs? Is it customer oriented? Is it action oriented? Well, if you look at the verbs, they're highlighted in green. Those are nice, strong verbs. Each one of those steps, that's what it looks like they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, starts with increase, configure, apply, define. Now, that word issues, it's a little problematic. What's an issue? Probably we need a stronger word there. So in some ways, yes, this does meet customer needs. We do know that this particular document came directly out of support tickets. The author worked closely. It's actually about a 2-page document. The author worked closely with support and then put together this document in response to problems people in support were having. Actually, the author is formerly from support. He's a former tech himself. So next slide. I'm going to show you another before from the same document. And what I've done is I've highlighted the weak bits in orange. And again, we've got this word issues at the bottom. So it begins with the words there are. I'm just going to tell you now, if you've never heard this before, hear it now. If you begin a sentence with there are or there is, it's probably a weak sentence and you need to rewrite it. And that's something I just look at every time and I say, okay, let's do that. So that's one problem. Things. What kind of word is things in technical documentation? What? Concrete noun, people. Our customers, they need to know what the things are. Passive voice, they may be taken. And mitigate. Now, there's nothing wrong with the word mitigate. It's actually a really nice word. I like it. But in technical documentation, when your audience is primarily, well, probably over 50% in our case, people who do not speak English as their first language, so the English as a second language speakers, mitigate is just confusing. So one of the things we did is we said, hey, please use a different word, take out issues, take out your passive voice. Next slide. And this is what the after on this particular piece of content was. He redid that little beginning. He took out the there is. The following tips can reduce problems when deploying a new instance of JBoss EAP. Okay, problems. That's what the issues are. They address some of the most common complications. Okay, that's what that was really all about. Okay, now we understand. When we were first looking at it as a group, that was what people were saying. What are these issues? What are these things? And as our author, when we met with him and talked about it, he rewrote it to make more sense, and that was great. Next slide. Another thing that we looked at, that we look at every time, and that we also spent some time looking at for this particular document, was are the titles and the headings clear? Do they reflect user goals instead of the structure of the product? Are they long enough to provide context? Are they short enough that the customer is willing to read them? My general rule of thumb is that your title should be at least 3 words long. If it's shorter than that, you can add a little context, but you shouldn't have more than 12 words. If it's more than 12 words, your reader may not actually finish reading it. They may just skip it. So that's my rule of thumb. I've looked it up. Your mileage may vary, but I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb. Next slide. So again, here is this original document with the original headings. Now, when you look at those headings, look at this. They're numbered. So my thought, and all of the thought of everybody in the group, was if I've got a set of numbered headings, this is a procedure, right? First I increase my ulimits, then I configure, then I apply, then I increase, then I define. Well, as it turned out, no, this was not a procedure. This was more like a triage list. So if you're having a problem with your setup and you want to have a successful setup, then you go through this triage list, and if you get to point 3 and you've finished it and now you can run, you're done. You don't have to do 4 and 5. That was really not obvious from the original structure. Next slide. So as we talked to the author, he said, well, what do you think of this word tips? Would that be better? And I said, yeah, let's try that. So he changed the heading, the overall title, to Tips for a Successful EAP Setup. So much better. Tips is much closer to getting the sense of a triage list. And success, that's what every customer wants. They want to be successful with their setup. They don't want to be preventing issues. They want to actually achieve a successful setup. And you'll notice each one of the steps is now tip 1, tip 2, tip 3, tip 4, tip 5. It makes it much more obvious that you could just stop. And you'll notice he also took this funny word ulimits, and he spelled it out to be user limits, and he told us what kind of patches need to be done to make sure that everything is running smoothly. Next slide. Minimalism Principle 3, findability. Make sure customers can find what they need when they need it. Next slide. Do you feel confident that your content will show up in search engines, whether it's Google or our Red Hat's internal search engine, Solar? Do the cross-references or links lead to relevant, wanted, and needed information? Do you provide closure so that a customer knows when a task is complete, especially if it is not obvious? Next slide. The document meets those needs pretty well. It's easy to scan and find information. The final document is even a little better than the original. Now that it's structured as tips, a reader can easily scan through those 5 tip titles and see if he's already done something. The document links to other articles when necessary. So basically, this particular part of minimalism, it did well. Next slide. Another minimalism principle, the fourth minimalism principle of 5, was no fluff or long or introductions or unnecessary context. Have you eliminated unnecessary introductions? Are your sections fairly short? Next slide. Have you limited your screen images? Have you removed roundabout expressions? Now, if you've got something in your documentation that's like, due to the fact that, just take it out now. It'll make everybody's lives happier. Take out actually, very, really. Those are things you can take out, and it doesn't, because they don't really add anything. Have you chunked long lists and other content into shorter, more digestible pieces? Have you removed passive voice? Those are the things to look for at this stage. Next slide. So this is a piece of content that we actually got from upstream for OpenShift. So this was not actually written by anybody within Red Hat. And I've highlighted in orange some of the problem areas. Must be created, being used, perhaps. Perhaps is another one of those words that doesn't belong in technical documentation. Much too mushy. It either is or it isn't. Must be created. Next slide. Is rebooted, must be reread, can be used. It's kind of a long, fairly dense piece of content right now. Next slide. And inside that piece of content, once we actually started looking at it and chunking it and pulling it apart and simplifying it and removing repetition, hey, look, there's a procedure hidden in there. How to change a secret. It's a short procedure, 1, 2, but it's there. Next slide. There was actually even another procedure, how to update a secret. You pull them apart, and then the customer can actually find, you remove the extraneous content, and the customer can find what they need to do to actually get their jobs done. Next slide. The final minimalism principle is troubleshooting. Can a customer recover when they run into a problem? Next slide. Do you provide the kind of information that makes rollback possible? Do you label troubleshooting information in the text so that it's easily accessible? Do you explain how to undo actions? Next slide. This UI is another one. This is another document we looked at. And this UI has 2 unpublished buttons in it. It's a bad UI, and it's actually been fixed now. But if you click this first unpublished button, it might seem like version 30 is all that's going to be unpublished, and maybe version 29 will now be published. But what happens if you click this unpublished button down here? Your guess is as good as mine. So I put a warning in here. As it turns out, if you click either of these buttons, the document is completely unpublished. It's no longer searchable. It's no longer viewable by the customer. The only people who can see it once it's unpublished are people who work at Red Hat. So that was a piece of information that we made a warning right away, so you know what the consequences are of your action right when you take that step. Next slide. So what I want all of you to do is to go back to your companies and try this at home. Write me. I've included my Twitter handle on every slide, and I'm going to have my email address at the end. And if you need help, I'll send you my slide deck, I'll send you my notes, I'll advise you. But it's possible. If you, whether it's minimalism or some other technique you want to evangelize, try it. And I think minimalism is a particularly good one, so go ahead and try that. Next slide. So say you're a lone technical writer with you, and you want to do this. You don't have a group of 100 people to crowdsource out of. What do? How can you make it possible? Get your writing friends and do it after work. Go to QA and your engineers, and give them the minimalist guidelines and our process, and see if you can work through it that way. If you're a bigger group, if you're a group where that's not so open to criticism and critiques, it doesn't matter. We had to invent this at Red Hat because basically I don't know that we would have been able to evangelize minimalism otherwise, but I think it will work at any of your companies for any of you. So just go out and try it and talk to me. I'd love to hear how it works, and I'd love to help you if you need it. Next slide. Now, these are my friends, Aneta and Brice, who could not come, but they pioneered this method in their own geos. And I just wanted to be sure to thank them. And here's the next slide. And I just want to say, these are a bunch of the people who actually participated in the minimalism crowdsourcing sessions. Because to effect real change, to critique documentation, to really create good documents, it takes a crowd. And I encourage all of you to go out and be open to new ideas, to try this, and to be kind. Thank you very much.